Keriel was born on a world made of fire and wind, where storms never rested, and warriors were made, not raised. Her first cry was heard in the middle of a sandstorm, and the elders said she would never fear anything, not the blade, not the flame, not even death. At age 12, she held her first weapon, and by 15, she had led her first victory against a rival clan. Her people were proud and strong, and Keriel was one of their best. Her eyes were sharp, her voice cold, her heart untouched by sorrow or mercy. Then came the humans, soft creatures with round faces and weak bodies. They arrived in great ships, asking for help in the war against the Hive. They spoke of alliances, of peace, of honor. But Keriel only laughed at their strange way of thinking. She had heard they cried. When friends died, they hugged each other before battle. They even sang songs to the stars, and yet they survived somehow. She was chosen to guide a young human soldier named Mike through a burned sector on the edge of the Hive zone. It was a quiet mission, just a routine patrol. They walked side by side across gray ash fields and broken metal towers. Keriel said little, and Mike said too much. He asked questions about her world, about her weapons, about how she stayed calm in battle. She told him fear was a poison, and her people were immune. They reached an old human base, half buried under dust and vines. The doors groaned as they entered. The light inside was dim. Machines lay broken, walls cracked. With age, Keriel scanned the shadows, expecting nothing but silence filled the space. It felt like the dead were watching. Mike moved ahead, excited like a child finding an old toy store. He called out to her, "Come look at this, it still works." Keriel followed and saw a strange machine, a round chair with wires and blinking lights. It looked like a trap. She stepped closer, and the air changed. A low buzz touched her skin, and something in her blood screamed. Her hand brushed the surface, and her knees buckled. Her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes wide, she saw flashes of meadow. A voice, laughter not her own. She stepped back too fast, her blade drawn, but the machine made no move. "What is it?" she asked, voice shaking. Mike smiled and said it was just a VR pod used for training, or fun, or memories. He said it like it was normal, but to Keriel it was not. She had never felt something like that, not even when facing the Hive Queen in close battle. She told Mike to destroy it. Now he looked confused why he asked. It is not a threat, but Keriel did not answer. Instead she stood still, eyes locked on the pod, her hands still shaking. That night they set up camp outside the base, the sky above full of cold stars. Mike fell asleep fast, wrapped in his soft blanket. Keriel sat by the fire silent, watching the shadows move around the old base. She did not want to admit it, but her heart beat faster than usual. In her mind, she still saw that field, the flowers, the wind, the laughter. She had not known such feelings, and they scared her more than any blade ever had. She thought of her people, her leaders, her training, and all the battles she had won without fear. And yet that simple human machine had touched something inside her, something she could not explain or kill or run from. It was not a weapon, but it had cut her deeper than any sword. When the fire burned low, Keriel rose and moved quietly toward the base again, her steps silent, her breath tight. She slipped through the broken door and stood before the pod once more. She lifted her blade, planning to end it, remove the threat, erase the feeling. But the pod blinked at her again, lights soft like eyes. Watching her, she reached out again, hand trembling. And as her skin touched it once more, the machine came alive, a soft hum, a flash of light, and then everything around her vanished. Keriel screamed, not in pain, not in anger, but in something else, something she did not yet understand, and the war she had always known began to feel smaller somehow, just as the machine showed her a world beyond battle, beyond fear, beyond everything she had ever believed. Keriel stood frozen as the machine wrapped her in light and sound. Her body was no longer hers, her breath no longer her own. She saw grass under her feet, and a blue sky above, with birds flying in patterns she had never seen. She felt warmth on her face, and a soft breeze in her hair, but she did not understand where she was, or why her hands reached out without her will, touching flowers soft as clouds. And in the distance she saw a house, and heard laughter. A name echoed in her ears, Lily, Lily, Lily. Then the light faded, and she was back in the base on her knees, gasping. Mike stood over her, his face full of worry, asking if she was hurt, but Keriel could not speak. She looked at her shaking hands, as if they belonged to another being. She rose slowly, still hearing the laughter from the vision. It was not a battle cry, it was not a scream, it was something soft and strange, something dangerous. Mike helped her sit, and explained the machine again. He said humans used it for memory, learning, escape, fun. He called it a joy machine, something to make people feel safe or happy during long missions. She stared at him, her voice sharp and low. What kind of warrior builds a machine to feel happiness? He smiled sadly, and said the kind that knows pain too well. Keriel turned away, not wanting more words, but that night sleep would not come. She closed her eyes and saw the sky, the house, the smile of a woman she had never met. She felt her chest tighten like something inside her wanted to break free. She had fought beasts that screamed and burned, but this small machine, this pod, had reached into her mind without a blade, without a sound. She rose while the night was still young, and walked back into the base, her fingers touching the walls, as if the building itself might remember something. When she reached the pod again, it blinked once, soft and quiet, like it was waiting. She sat in it this time, slowly, and the world disappeared. Now she stood in a room full of books and lights. Her body was younger, her hands smaller. A man sat at a table, smiling, calling her Lily again. She wanted to pull back, scream, break the world around her, but she could not move. The feelings were too strong, too deep. The man taught her how to read, how to write, how to dream. He told her stories of stars and oceans and love, and she felt each word wrap around her, like armor, not of steel, but of emotion and trust. When she came out again, she was crying, though she did not understand why. Mike was there again, waiting, always waiting. He handed her a cloth, but said nothing. Kirill wiped her eyes and asked, "How many times can you enter?" He said, "As many as you want." The next day she returned again and again, each time learning new things, feeling more than she had ever known. Her heart no longer cold, her voice no longer sharp. The pod showed her both joy and pain, laughter and loss. She saw herself as a mother, holding a child that was not real, yet felt more true than any victory she had won. She saw herself dancing under the rain, kissing someone she had never met, living 100 lives in moments, and with each visit the warrior in her shook. Mike watched her change, but said nothing. He only made sure she was safe. He brought food, water, silence, and let her return to the pod again and again, until Kirill began to speak, not of war, not of death, but of dreams, of questions, of wonder. She asked him why humans made such things, why build a machine to feel. Mike looked at the stars, then back at her, and said, "Because when war ends, we need to remember what peace felt like." Kirill had no answer, only silence, but silence was loud now, full of meaning, full of color, and Kirill felt herself slipping away from the warrior she once was. She knew her people would not understand, would not accept such change. Still, she could not stop returning. Not yet. The machine called her, not with sound, but with memory. And each time she screamed, it was not from fear, but from awakening, from knowing that joy too was a kind of power, one her blade could never give her, and now she feared that power more than anything else in the galaxy. Kirill sat in the pod again, and let the light take her once more. Her eyes closed, her hands resting on her knees, her breath calm, but her heart no longer belonged to the battlefield. It belonged to the world inside the machine, a world she never lived yet knew deeply. Each time the light returned, it brought her closer to a life not her own. This time she was in a classroom, sunlight pouring through wide windows. Her fingers held a pen, her lips whispered answers to questions she did not understand. Around her were laughing students, friends, who called her Lily, and smiled without reason. A teacher praised her for her writing, and she felt pride rise inside her, warm and deep and strange. Kirill tried to fight it, tried to remind herself that she was not Lily, she was not human, but the feelings were strong. They clung to her like vines, wrapping her soul. The bell rang, and she stood from her chair, her bag slung over her shoulder. She walked home past trees with leaves that danced in the wind, and for a moment she forgot her blade, her armor, her mission. She entered a house where a woman called her name and hugged her. The warmth of that embrace shook Kirill more than the blast of any enemy weapon. She sat at a table full of food and stories and laughter, and her heart ached with something she could not name. Then it changed again, a storm outside, thunder crashing, and the woman was crying. Kirill felt her own tears fall, though she did not know why. She reached out, hugged the woman tightly, and said it would be okay. Her voice was not hers, yet it felt like truth. When the pod finally released her, she stumbled forward, gasping for air like she had surfaced from deep water. Mike caught her, held her steady, and said nothing. She leaned against him, her hands gripping his arms, not out of weakness, but to feel something real again, something that was hers. She looked at him, eyes wide and voice shaking, and said it felt more real than anything in her life. She spoke of the classroom, the home, the woman who held her, and the pain that burned after the storm. Mike nodded slowly and said, "Sometimes the past we never had can feel stronger than the one we do." Kirill sat beside him that night, staring into the fire, eyes unfocused, her thoughts far away. She asked him if memories could become part of you, even if they were not born in you. Mike said the human mind was strange. It could grow roots in any soil. If the feeling was deep enough. She stayed quiet for a long time, then finally said, "My people will not understand this. They believe only in battle, in strength, in honor. But this is something else. Something we do not have, and now I do not know who I am anymore." Mike looked at her and said, "Maybe that is a good thing. Maybe now you can be more than what they made you." Kirill closed her eyes and let the fire warm Her face, she felt the wind pass over her, and wondered if she would ever return to who she was the next day. They continued their patrol, but everything felt different. The sky seemed larger, the silence around them deeper. She looked at the world with new eyes. Not as a warrior scanning for threats, but as someone seeing beauty in broken things. They passed ruins covered in moss and vines, and Kiriel stopped to touch the wall, a child's drawing still visible on the stone. Faded but full of life, she traced the lines with her fingers, and felt the echo of laughter once shared there. Mike watched her and said nothing, just stood with her in silence. Later that night, she returned to the pod once more, and this time she entered, not as a fighter, but as a seeker. She no longer feared what she might feel inside. She wanted to know more. She became a nurse in a hospital, holding a stranger's hand as he passed his last breath. She became a painter, filling walls with colors she never knew existed. She became a singer, a writer, a mother, a friend, each memory stitching itself into her soul until she could no longer tell where. Kiriel ended, and Lily began. When she awoke, she looked into the mirror and touched her face, the same face as always, yet different, somehow softer, not in skin, but in spirit. And for the first time in her life, Kiriel whispered, I am not only a warrior anymore. And though the walls around her were still broken, and the war outside still burned, she felt something inside her shift. The past she never lived had become part of her, and she was no longer afraid of that truth. Kiriel stood at the edge of the canyon, her eyes staring at the jagged sky, her fingers twitching beside the hilt of her blade. The wind carried dust and smoke from battles fought miles away. But she did not feel drawn to the noise anymore, not like before. Mike stepped beside her and said nothing. He had learned that silence from her, but now she was the one who broke it. She said softly, I think I was never taught what to do after the war. He looked at her and asked, do you mean when the fighting ends? She shook her head and said, no, I mean when the fighting inside begins. They had spent the last few days away from the front lines, but Kiriel had not returned to the pod since the last memory she had walked in a field and held a baby with Lily's hands. She had felt love in a way no war medal had ever given, and now she could not forget it. She trained with her blade every morning, but her strikes were slower, less sharp. Her mind wandered to things that had no place in combat. The sound of a child's laugh, the feel of soft fabric, the smell of baked bread. Things she had never known, and now missed. Mike tried to explain what peace was, how humans had built it again and again after each war. How they carried scars and stories, how they sang to remember, not to forget. Kiriel listened, but her mind felt split in two, the warrior and the dreamer, the killer and the mother, the blade and the flower. One night she sat alone, watching the stars, and thought of her people back home. Would never understand what she had seen in the pod. They would call her weak, soft, broken. She remembered the face of her old commander, a woman with eyes made of steel, who once told her emotion is the first crack in armor. Kiriel no longer believed that. She turned to Mike and said, I want to go back to the pod one last time, not to escape, not to feel joy, but to find something I lost. He asked, what? And she said, I do not know, but I will know when I see it. They returned to the base, the door still groaning open, the dust still heavy in the air. The pod waited like a heart still beating. Kiriel stepped in and closed her eyes. This time she was not Lily, not a student, not a mother, not a nurse. She was herself, standing in a dark place with mirrors all around. Each mirror showed her a different version of herself, one with blood on her hands, one with flowers in her hair, one with eyes full of fire, one with tears running down her cheeks. She walked past them slowly, touching the glass, feeling each life pulse beneath her fingers. Then she found one mirror that showed her now the Kiriel who had seen both war and peace, both pain and love, both blade and embrace. She stared into it for a long time and said, I can be all of these. I do not have to choose. The mirror cracked, but did not shatter, and a door opened behind her. She stepped through and found herself in a meadow again, not as Lily, but as Kiriel. In her own body, and behind her, walked her people, warriors dressed in steel. Eyes cold, she turned to face them, but instead of drawing her blade, she opened her arms, and they stopped, confused, uncertain. The pod released her, and she fell forward again, but this time she was not afraid. She looked at Mike and said, I saw them. All the versions of me, they are real, they are part of me now. Mike smiled and said, maybe that is what humans meant when they said the soul is made of many rooms. Kiriel rose and took a deep breath, her voice strong but gentle now. I must return to the front, but not as who I was. I need to show them what I found. Mike asked, do you think they will listen? And she said, maybe not at first, but someone has to begin the change. Someone has to show them that feeling does not make you weak. It makes you alive. She turned toward the war, not with the hunger for blood, but with the need to speak, to show, to lead. Not just with steel, but with truth. Kiriel, the fearless warrior, now carried something greater than a blade. She carried a memory of joy, and the will to share it with those who never knew it could exist. Smoke rose across the blood-red sky as Kirill stood among the ruins. Her armor cracked her arms. Dusted with ash, the ground around her burned, and the air was thick with screams in steel, but inside her there was a strange calm, not the cold focus of a warrior, but a silence filled with memory. Mike crouched behind a fallen wall, his weapon ready, his breath heavy. "This is bad," he whispered. "They've pushed through every line." Kirill nodded, but her mind was not on the swarm, or the sounds of war. It was on a single moment that had not yet come. Orders had come from the command tower. Hold the line at all costs. No retreat, no mercy. Kirill had heard those words 100 times. But now they tasted bitter. She moved forward, blade in hand, her eyes scanning not for threats, but for signs of something she could not explain. She remembered the last memory from the pod, a girl holding her mother's hand walking through a flower market. With music in the air, it had felt so real, so warm. Now, all she could smell was smoke, and fear explosions lit the field. The enemy poured out from the trenches, bodies covered in dark armor, with glowing eyes like fire. Kirill raised her blade, not with hatred, but with sorrow. She struck true fast, clean, but her heart ached with every blow. Mike fought beside her, yelling commands, helping the wounded, pulling allies from the rubble. Kirill moved like wind, fast and precise, but each time she cut down an enemy, she whispered, "I am sorry." Then she saw her, the enemy soldier, no older than Kirill, had been at her first battle. A girl alone, holding a blaster too large for her arms, her hands shaking, her eyes full of terror. Kirill stopped her, blade lifted ready, but her body frozen. The girl looked at her wide-eyed, waiting for death behind Kirill. Someone shouted, "Finish her, do it now," but Kirill did not move. Instead, she stepped back slowly, her blade still in hand, but lowered the girl, dropped her weapon, and ran her footsteps. Lost in the noise of battle, Mike reached her side. "What happened? Why did you let her go?" Kirill said. "She reminded me of someone," but she did not say Lily. She did not say herself. She did not say the child in the pod. She just stared at the smoke, and said nothing. Later, when the fighting died down, and the field was still, the commanders arrived, their eyes cold, and their words sharp. They demanded to know why Kirill hesitated, why she spared an enemy. Kirill stood tall and said she saw a future worth more than one more death. They called her weak, a traitor, a shame to her people. They said she had been corrupted by human softness, and her name would be erased from the warrior wall. Mike stepped forward to defend her, but Kirill raised a hand and said, "No, let them speak. They do not understand yet, but maybe one day they will." That night, around the small fire, Kirill sat with Mike, her armor beside her, her blade buried in the dirt. She asked him, "What do humans do when they are called traitors for showing mercy?" Mike answered, "We carry that pain and walk forward anyway, because someone must be first." Kirill nodded, her fingers tracing the old marks on her armor, each one a victory, each one now feeling heavier. She said, "I was trained to be perfect in battle, but no one taught me how to be strong in peace." The next day they marched again, but this time Kirill wore no insignia, her name stripped from rank, her title gone, but her purpose clear. She did not fight to win anymore, she fought to protect, and when she saw young soldiers hesitate, she did not scream orders. She stood beside them, showed them how to breathe, how to move, how to choose when to strike, and when to wait. Some followed her, others turned away, but whispers spread of the warrior who had walked into battle and let an enemy live, and somehow came back alive. Kirill knew the path ahead would not be easy, but she also knew this fear was not the absence of violence, it was the fear of changing what you were taught to believe, and she had chosen to face that fear head-on and walk through it without turning back. The council chamber on her homeworld was cold, not in temperature but in silence, thick and crushing. Kirill stood in the center, surrounded by high warriors and judgment eyes, hard as stone, arms crossed, voices sharp and ready. She said nothing as they listed her failures. They called her broken, said she let the enemy escape, said she protected a human over her own people, said she returned from the battlefield, not with blood and glory, but with weakness and doubt. She looked at them not with anger, but with something deeper, with knowing. She did not speak until they demanded an answer. Then Kirill said, "I saw a future in a machine, and now I carry that truth." They laughed. One voice said, "The humans poisoned her." Another said, "Exile is mercy. She deserves worse." A third one said, "No traitor should wear our colors again." Kirill was stripped of title and honor, her name carved off the stone of warriors, her armor taken, her clan rights removed. She was left standing in the wind outside the gates alone, for the first time since her first battle. Mike waited at the base of the hill, his eyes met hers and she nodded. Once not in defeat but in decision, she had chosen this path, she had known the cost. They left the city behind, traveled across dead fields, toward the edge of contested space, where old outposts still stood broken and forgotten. Kirill said, "There was something she needed to do, something left unfinished. She guided Mike to a hidden structure half buried in ash. A human base that once trained diplomats and memory pilots. It held a backup of the VR system, the same type of pod that had changed her inside the dark room. She activated it, dust blowing from the screen. She entered the pod again, but this time she carried her own memories with her, not just Lily's, not just the visions of soft hands and warm kitchens, but her own truth, her own journey. She stood in a space not bound by walls. The machine's light forming an image of a battlefield, then a classroom, then a home, the echoes of both lives overlapping. She did not run, she did not scream, she faced them all, the warrior, the mother, the fighter, the dreamer, and then she spoke to the machine. She said, "Show them what I saw." The machine glowed brighter, its interface opened to external link. Sharing was possible with others. If they connected, Kiriel looked at Mike, he nodded, and stepped into the second pod beside hers. Their minds linked, the memories opened like floodgates, and the truth spread. The council received a signal. The elders were forced to watch what Kiriel had seen, and felt they saw the moments of pain, the softness of joy, the weight of peace, the fire of kindness. Some cried, others looked away, but one voice among them whispered, "Perhaps we were wrong." Not all believed, not all accepted, but seeds were planted, and Kiriel knew that was enough for. Now news spread across systems. The warrior girl who faced fear, not in battle but in feeling the alien, who touched human memory and changed without shame. Her story became a whisper among soldiers, a spark in dark places. One day a shuttle landed. Near their outpost, a young alien girl stepped out, armored too big for her eyes. Unsure, she looked at Kiriel and said, "I want to understand what you saw." Kiriel led her to the pod. More came days later, some human, some not. They came not for war, training, but for memory connection. Kiriel became something new, not a commander, not a fighter, but a guide. She taught them not to swing the blade faster, but to feel slower, to listen. Not only with ears, but with heart. Mike stood beside her, always watching, smiling, never claiming credit, just supporting. Kiriel knew without him she would never have found the machine, never have listened to what it showed. In the quiet between stars, Kiriel sometimes looked at her reflection, not in glass, but in the minds she touched. She saw herself not as fallen, but risen, not erased, but rewritten. She was branded a traitor by her people, but called a human by those who saw her truth, and she finally understood the deepest strength was not in striking, first or last, but in choosing when not to strike at all. Rain fell gently on the training ground, where no drills were taking place, no shouts, no stomping boots, no clash of blades, only the soft tapping of water, and a strange quiet as if the soil itself waited for something. Kiriel stood beneath the open sky, eyes closed, arms folded across her chest. She had fought 1,000 battles, but today felt different, not like war, not like peace, something new. Mike walked up to her holding a small device, the newest version of the pod, compact, sleek, upgraded. He placed it gently on the platform, and said, "The first one changed you, maybe this one will change them." Kiriel opened her eyes, nodded, and said, "It is time." Across the stars messages had gone out to warriors, students, leaders, and wanderers of every race. Come see what the human machine showed the alien girl, who never feared death until she met joy. They arrived slowly, first a boy from a frozen moon, hands scarred from mining, then a healer from a jungle world who had lost her whole family in the war, then a human captain haunted by choices made during a siege. They came not to be trained in weapons, but to step into the pod and face the one thing most warriors feared, feeling one by one. They entered and emerged changed. Some cried, some laughed, some stood still for hours, saying nothing, but their eyes were different. Kiriel stood beside each one, never rushing them, never explaining. Then came the young warrior girl. Her armor bright, her face proud. She said she had heard had screamed inside the machine, and still returned whole. Kiriel nodded, and said, "I did not return whole. I returned more." She gestured to the pod. The girl hesitated, then stepped in moments past. Then the scream came, sharp roar, not of pain, not of fear, but of release. The girl stumbled out, fell to her knees, tears mixing with the rain. Kiriel knelt beside her, held her hand and whispered, "You are not broken." Your opening words spread faster than warships, faster than fear. They called it the scream of awakening, not just a sound, but a truth carried across voices, species, and space. Soon the council, who had cast Kiriel out, sent a message, not of apology, but of request. They asked for the pod, they asked for a guide. Kiriel and Mike returned to the hall once, filled with judgment, but now heavy with curiosity. She stood before them, not in armor, but in soft fabric, made by human hands. She spoke not of weapons, but of memories. She said, "This is not surrender, it is understanding." Watched as one of their own entered the pod, and emerged silent, holding a flower from a memory not his own. It trembled in his palm as if unsure it belonged, but he held it like something sacred. Some still rejected it, called it weakness, called her a fool, but others nodded and walked forward. Kirill knew change would not come to all, but it had come to some, and that was enough to begin years. Past the war slowed, not from treaties but from questions. Why do we fight? What do we protect? What are we trying to return to when the last battle ends? The pods spread across systems, in ships, in schools, in homes. Not to replace learning, but to remind souls of what they had lost. Laughter, music, gentleness, the color of a sunrise scene for the first time. Kirill became more than a warrior, more than a teacher. She became a symbol, not of strength, not of peace, but of the choice to feel. Children grew up hearing her story not as myth, but as memory. She who walked into war and screamed, not when struck but when shown love, and walked back into battle with her heart wide open. Mike stood beside her, through it all, quiet, loyal, unshaken. One day she turned to him and asked, "Do you remember the first time I screamed?" He smiled and said, "How could I forget? It was the first time I believed the war could end." She nodded and looked to the stars and whispered, "If even one warrior learns to feel before they strike, then I have not fought in vain." And somewhere across the galaxy, another pod hummed to life. Another soul stepped inside, and for the first time another scream echoed, a scream not of fear, but of awakening, a scream that could one day save the future, just like it saved her.